Hold on, get the recording going. So Chris Bergh, tell us a bit about what you want to talk about on the topic of data ops.
Oh, anything and everything. So yeah, I think that the sort of data area is a good point on how you build a team, how you do leadership, how you do data ops, what data ops means, what are the benefits, how you do it, all sorts of anything and everything around the concept of data ops, people, tech.
Okay. Yeah.
Data.
What I'll do is I'll give my take on what it means. I'll tell the horror story, then I'll turn it over to you. And for each of you, when I introduce you, I'll say, and here we have Christopher Bergh of DataKitchen. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing in data ops. And that lets you kind of get your opening statement out about what you're doing, how it works. Feel free to mention your company name several times. I want you guys to get traction from this, of course. And this is obviously radio. So we're in about 22 markets now, I think, on actual radio stations driving down the street. So we always start high level and then try to drill into sort of core samples is the way I describe it. But you'll hear me constantly going back and saying, okay, what that means is X, Y, and Z, because we're catering to a broad audience here. But we also do promote to our built-in database, and those are all data professionals. So data ops is very much top of mind to those guys. So let's see, Floyd Smith, Unravel Data, what do you want to talk about?
Let's see. So first I'm going to talk about, well, I was listening to some of the earlier episodes. So frankly, I'm going to thank Chris for evangelizing the term for years out there. Thanks, Chris. You did a lot of good spade work to get this, kind of create this umbrella that we can all fit under and make it easier for people to understand. So that's awesome work. And I work with words for a living for a long time now, and so this is much appreciated. And then I'm going to talk about how data drift is the premise, right? So I'm going to talk about how that relates to data ops, and there's data ops and ML ops and AI ops. So I'm going to do like Wikipedia and disambiguate among those difference. Yes.
Good. That's great.
Right on. And then I'm going to talk about what we're doing, to help spread the word about data ops and why it's important. And then I'm going to illustrate the issues that we help with the example of Adobe. Adobe is a customer of ours. They've been fantastically successful the last decade or so, and only the last couple of that is with us. So we, they're doing a lot of things right, but we've helped them solve some problems. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of Adobe, because most people know who Adobe is, and right now they're kind of a quiet business success story as well. So that'll get us into some of the potential of tech, along with how data ops is helping accelerate that for some people. So that's my main thrust is kind of explaining our product and what we do in terms of what Adobe does. That's more understandable to people than a lot of the diagrams I would normally show. The visuals, the slides we all have with these spaghetti webs of single data.
Right.
Can't show those, so I got to give a real example. So that'll be my focus.
Okay, cool, perfect. And Sheel, Choksi. Don't say Chotsky, Choksi. Sheel, Choksi. Tell us what you want to talk about.
Sure. And if it helps, I'll put a phonetic type pronunciation in the chat.
There you go.
Like a piece of chalk and then seeing. So
see,
Choksi.
There you go.
And what I was thinking about is, a lot of this data ops that we're talking about takes a lot of its practices from DevOps, and a lot of the DevOps practices, even if you go even a little bit further back, comes from a lot of the software engineering practices of agile development, TDD, extreme programming, how to get business value out faster. And previously, I've worked at a company called Pivotal Labs, which was started by
Sure.
Exactly. And so what we did there was a lot of the consulting practice of getting software teams to be more agile in their development, bring these practices in, and what it looks like to start establishing these practices in orgs, like both from the software perspective and how that applies now in data ops, and how to help start establishing these practices. How do you start transforming into it? What are the pieces that you need? Do you start with technology aspects of it? Do you start with people? Do you start with just testing your code? And how do you start putting that together to start getting the impacts from data ops that we're also excited about?
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think one of the challenges too is that you have all these moving parts, right? And what you want to do is come up with a framework that allows the different groups to do their thing without disrupting what other people are doing, instead of traditional workflow, which is always linear, right? Back in the day, it was always linear, but now it doesn't have to be. It could be, multi-threaded essentially, which is a big deal. And I think that, I'm a closet programmer, I guess. I did programming when I was 13, right? I've done a little bit since. I taught myself HTML, which is pretty easy, of course. And I played around a little bit with Java, which is a good bit more complicated. But, so I understand how a lot of this stuff works. But these days, man, like microservices, holy geez, like, wow, it gets pretty complicated pretty fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the problem is like, software's been in the complexity business for years, and the building systems that process data and give it to people sort of passed the complexity threshold about 5 or 10 years ago. And
right.
When you're in the data business, you're actually in the complexity business as well. So you have two things to do.
Chris, I'm going to use my insider's privileges here and ask if you would mind mentioning a little bit during your time, just how you guys got onto the term data ops and how useful you have found it or not found it, during your time working with it, if that can fit into what you want to talk about. But I'd enjoy hearing that myself. And
this is Floyd, is this a question for me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, and I appreciate your comment on the spade work. My back hurts a lot actually, so I'm kind of sore. So I may moan a bit from all that spade work, but no, I appreciate the comment. Yeah, and I certainly can talk about that. And and the diversity of ops terms out there is crazy nowadays.
It's everywhere right now. I figured out ops is like the actual work. That's what they're talking about. There's marketing ops and data ops and ML ops. It's like, that's the stuff that someone has to do, right? Workflow.
Yeah. Well, they all have sort of a similar thread, and I think come from the same sort of software and manufacturing idea space.
Right. Sure. OEM. The fact that you use the term OEM, original equipment manufacturer, right? Like there's a hardware term that moved into the software world, right?
Yeah.
You get a lot of that stuff going around. All right, we got 2 minutes. So again, the breaks are 24:44 and then 58:50 we're out. If you guys can stick around for 9 more minutes, we do what's called a podcast bonus segment, and we use that to replace the local commercials that run when we post the archive for the podcast version, basically. But yeah, let's just have some fun trying to educate the audience. I always tell people, think about senior business people that you're trying to pitch on the concepts, right? They don't maybe understand the tech completely, but they do understand the metaphors that you can use to describe what it's doing and why you need it. And I just came up with that idea of the horror story last night when my buddy told me. I was like, "Ooh, ouch."
That's a great place to start.
Lawsuits, unhappy people, privacy concerns.
Oh yeah, heartburn. Yeah, I've been there, man. It sucks.
He read to me from the email that got sent to this poor guy, and it was just like, oh no. It's almost like, are they just telling me to quit? I think they're just saying, get the hell out. But he's an important person. And my buddy's like, actually, he's the only guy who knows that part of the stack. And so, if you want to kick him out, I guess you can, but you're going to push everything back 3 months. That's the crazy thing to me is like, it takes so long to onboard when you get developers into these big companies and just understand the stack. It takes like 2-3 months just to know what you're even working with. What are the component parts? How do they interact with each other? Where is this? Where is that? It's not an easy thing to figure out. And they're just locked down, man. I've heard stories about how, some of the biggest companies in the world is just, the code base is locked down.
That's why I like working in startups. You're actually present when all that stuff gets set up.
That's right. That's right. Then you can go do another startup and then another one.
As soon as it gets complicated.
Right. Just bail.
The constraints and agenda setting. Take control and learn more about the Gab Radio Network. Email info@talkunfettered.com. That's info@talkunfettered.com. The Gab Radio Network. Talk Unfettered.
You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now tune in to DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back. Welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yes, indeed, your host here, Eric Kavanaugh. And folks, I am really excited today to talk about, of course, a very hot topic in the data world, but a very pressing topic too. It's something we're hearing more and more about for obvious reasons. It's called data ops. We're going to talk about what that means, why you should care, why it's important. And it's very important, folks. It kind of spins out of something called DevOps, which I really credit for, in large part, solving the business IT divide that we've talked about for years and years in the technology world. So we're going to hear from several great guests: Christopher Bergh of a company called DataKitchen. We have Floyd Smith from Unravel Data, and Sheel Choksi of Ascend, all very cool companies doing very cool things. And first, let me just talk about DevOps. So developer operations. We have developers working directly with operations folks to make stuff work on the front lines of business, mostly online, but other places too, offline, on-prem, if you will. That was a big thing. Data ops came along because data wound up being kind of like the redheaded stepchild. Everyone just forgot about the data. Let's focus on the operations and the development. That's great, but the data is what we use for all these transactions. Data is the fuel of every single business. And now, of course, we have big data. We have big data at scale. We have real world data out there, tremendous amounts of information. And I have a little horror story that I'll share with you. A buddy of mine works for a pretty large company. I won't say the name, but they had a level 1 incident with rolling out some new functionality. And what happened is a developer on the front lines who was responsible for pushing this into production at the last second decided to check a little box. It was a caching thing, a caching box, and it just all hell broke loose, because what happened is client A saw client B's data, client C saw client B's data, all this stuff happened. It just blew up. It was a huge problem. My buddy jokes, he's like, rule number 1 in software, you need the undo button, Control Z. Like, you always want to be able to go, oops, no, let's pull that back. But if it's in a production environment, a lot of these systems are homegrown. So it was a huge problem. And I would argue it's both a DevOps failure and a data ops failure. DevOps, because this developer should not have had that checkbox available if it wasn't supposed to be used in that context. That's a systems design issue. But then data ops, because the data that got compromised, that wound up in the hands of competitors, basically, someone didn't really think through how the data would flow through that system and be exposed should someone accidentally or unintentionally or foolishly check this little box. And that's a big problem. I mean, there are going to be potential lawsuits, all kind of, someone's probably going to get fired. It's a really, really nasty, unpleasant situation. And it's a lesson for why you want data ops and DevOps. And so with that, let me bring in Christopher Bergh, the guy who coined the term to me about 4 years ago of data ops. Chris, tell us a bit about DataKitchen, your company, and why you created this platform to do data ops.
Well, Eric, it's nice to talk to you again, and thanks for that introduction. And I think it's, we're a software company that's focused on building data ops software, and that may not mean a lot to a lot of different people, but the thing of it is, I come at it from a manager's perspective, and what do you do when you manage people and something goes wrong? And so imagine that person who checked the wrong box, and they're feeling bad. They screwed up, the data's wrong, it threatens the business. Now imagine you're their manager, and I've been in that role. And for many years, I thought the solution to it was to basically blame the person for their problem and say, they're an idiot. Let's fire them, get a new guy in and we'll fix it, new guy or girl. And so I spent how I came to data ops is I spent a lot of years writing software. And then in 2005, I thought I would do this thing that was easier to do data and analytics and produce value from data. And I'm a big software guy, and I thought, oh man, this will be easy. My kids are small, no problem. And it turned out to be hell. And I had that experience where we produced wrong data. And similar cases where threatens the company, thousands of users got the wrong data and things sort of went to hell. And I thought for a while that I should blame the individual contributor. And this kept happening. And I started to look at the root cause. And it turns out, when people made cars, like I grew up in the 80s in Wisconsin. And at the time, my dad was in a union and he drove a Toyota Corolla, which was a little bit risky to be in a union in the 80s in a Toyota because you're supposed to drive American cars. And he's like, well, it lasts longer, it's cheaper, it's better, so I'm going to buy it. And so why did Toyota, the Corolla he bought, go on to become, if not the biggest automaker in the world, and American Motors, which had a factory near where I grew up, got out of business? And it's because they figured out how to manage people, not because American Motors had better robots or better tech. It's they managed the people and process better. And there's an American who started that idea called Deming. And I read Deming when all these data problems were happening. And what Deming said is 94% of the time, when you have a problem like this, it's the system's fault, the system that the people work in, rather than the individual contributor.
Right.
So only 6% of the time, it's a person screwing up. And that's a very different management philosophy than, let's say you're running a theater and a play and someone screws up their lines. Well, maybe they're not a great actor and maybe you should get rid of them and maybe firing is a good idea. But if they work in a factory, or perhaps they make software, or perhaps they make data and analytics, it's a systemic problem. And you as a leader own the system that they work in.
Mm-hmm.
And so data ops is this idea that acknowledges that sort of how you do things is more important than what you do. The factory is more important than the car. And so the thing next to what you're doing, the system, is really what you own as a leader. And that you've got to build it and manage it and improve it. And when it comes down to things going wrong, it's almost always not the individual person's fault. It's you as a leader didn't build the system that make that person successful. And so it's away from blaming people and looking for solutions to it. And that's, I think, is a very positive thing, and why, I think data ops and data and analytic teams are suffering, because this idea, or data and analytic teams are suffering because they're still living under this own idea that it's their fault. And it's not.
Well, that's interesting too. And the whole concept of culpability in general comes in here as well, right? And also I recall when we first met, you had this great storyline around the hero's journey, or being the hero, being the data hero. And you see this in our movies, in our society, everywhere. You've got heroes and bad guys, right? Good guys and bad guys, good cop, bad cop, all this stuff. And with the hero mindset, well, who doesn't want to be a hero? But the point is, you don't want to be a hero every day.
Yeah.
Right. So because it'll just wear you out. And it's just not realistic either. And I think this is the sort of black and white paradigm we've caught ourselves in, when in reality, the world is very gray. And I guess to your point, we need to step back from this finger pointing mindset, because it doesn't get us anywhere. We were talking before the show about, in this particular example, these systems are homegrown. They are incredibly complex. When you get a job as even a manager or an engineer at some of these big companies, it's going to take you weeks, if not months, just to ramp up and know what you're working on, where it fits in the architecture, what it does, how it's supposed to operate. And all of these environments are supposed to be somewhat loosely coupled, such that you can work on this and not affect that. And that's kind of the bigger vision with data ops too, is to provide visibility and governance around the management of data sets that are used for analysis, right, Chris?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, whether it's a factory, or you're building software, or you're building a data and analytic process, it's a shared, technically complicated thing that you as a leader own and your team builds and operates. And so the management philosophy actually is the same. And the ideas of data ops came from manufacturing and came from software DevOps. And people have figured out how to do this, how to manage teams and build systems when it's complicated. And so I think that is a important idea here, is we're just sort of standing on the shoulders of what people have learned already. And data ops is a management philosophy that helps you when you've got a bunch of people working on a shared technically complicated thing. And I think right now with data and analytics, it is very complicated, right? They're big systems. And like you said, a lot of people are living in the hero's world where I got to stay up late, and when things go wrong, I got to jump through hoops, and that burns people out. And as a result, the tenures of CDOs are short. There's plenty of people who've gotten master's degrees in data science who are, after a year or two, being burnt out. And so, from my perspective, my fellow nerds, my fellow data and analytic nerds are suffering. And I think this, in some ways, data ops is the solution to that suffering.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we're going to have Sheel Choksi on in the next segment from a company called Ascend. And I'll use this as a segue to bring Floyd in here from Unravel Data. I remember he made such a great point to me, Sean Knapp did, of Ascend, the CEO, a while ago, about how these days the managers for developers are really beholden to keeping those developers around, because the number one metric for success for their raises and their promotions and so forth is to keep your team together. So if you are fearful of losing anyone, well, that's going to impact your decision making. It's going to impact how hard you are on people or whatever. So these are all management issues that are really important for getting the most out of your people. And to your point, Chris, real quick, about helping people enjoy their jobs and be productive and not be burned out and not suffer, because that's no fun. Like what this guy did is a mistake. There's no doubt it's a mistake, but to your point, that the system should have been designed better. There should have been a safeguard in place, and there just wasn't. And so now they have to deal with that. But you make a really good point about, it's like almost Buddhist in a way, right? Because the Buddhist said he helped people try to end suffering, right? We know life is hard, we know it's complicated, but at least don't be unhappy in your world. And I've got a whole theme. I'm going to write a book one of these days. I've started it on morale, and how morale is the single most important characteristic of any organization. And with that, I'll bring in Floyd Smith from Unravel Data. Stick around, Chris, for the roundtables. Floyd Smith from Unravel Data. Tell us a bit about your background and what you folks are doing, and the sort of history of data ops from your perspective.
I've gotten to do this stuff for a while. So started out my career in tech at Cox Cable. And that's ironically, Cox is now a customer of Unravel Data. So
nice.
The was kind of turned. I worked at Apple for a good long time, and learned a ton there. Lots of smart people doing interesting things, and they continue to do amazing stuff. I worked at Visa, and written a number of books along the way as well. I got to work in the UK, did some work in New Zealand. So, tech's been good to me. I spotted something coming a few years ago, which is a lot of people have spotted, not just me, that AI is, going to change the world, and that started to happen. And so Unravel Data is where AI is used to help solve some of the problems about developing and delivering software. We're not the only ones using AI to do that, but we're the only ones using AI in the particular way that we are in this data ops world. So I'll try and explain the term data ops a little bit, with tip of the cap to Chris, who's been explaining data ops for a good long time. I'll try to add a little bit of something to what he's talked about. So when you think of data science, and that's a lot of really smart people analyzing tons and tons of data to figure out ways to make business work better, to understand what's already happened, to plan the future, and then to deliver cool solutions to people. So when you use an Airbnb and it's popping up options for you, when you call an Uber or a Lyft, when you go online and you're buying one thing and it suggests you buy another, that can be annoying, but it can also be really helpful. So that's the data part of it. And then ops is delivering it. Ops is making it all work. Have you ever been in the middle of doing a transaction online, or you're on hold and suddenly you just go into space, like you just lose the whole thing you were just doing? Okay, so that's a failure in ops, checking that checkbox at the wrong time and exposing a lot of data. Well, that's an ops failure where the person was set up to fail, because
Right.
there's a cute little checkbox, right, that they should never check. And there's data that wasn't protected well enough that one person checks one wrong checkbox and it just splatters all over the place and everyone sees it. So data ops is bringing those together. You guys talked about the hero's journey. Well, King Arthur had his round table, right? And that's where all his knights got together and sat down. And that's how I think of data ops. It's that round table where the heroes in development and the heroes in delivery and the planners and the business intelligence people can all sit down and get together and work out their problems in a way that prevents wars, right? If all the guys with the sharp swords sit down and talk, maybe they'll hack each other a little less with the swords down the road. So that's how I think of data ops, is a convening thing where you bring a lot of people together. The intro for the show talked about data drift. That's a specific problem in machine learning where, let's say that you suddenly give 18-year-olds the right to vote. Well, the model that predicted voter behavior the year before doesn't work the same way anymore, because suddenly all these younger people flooded into the election. But if no one changes the model and no one takes that into account, your results are going to be different because your data drifted, your data set in this case drifted. You can also have sensors go down and so on. So just to kind of pull some of these things together, you'll now hear, if you're into this stuff, you'll hear about data ops, ML ops, AI ops. They are separate disciplines, but they're all aspects of the same thing. Everyone in tech is trying to deliver solutions to people to help them do really cool stuff. And data ops, ML ops, AI ops is all of them are about getting the right people together, work on these problems cooperatively, collaboratively in advance, so no one has that nasty little checkbox to check and derail the darn train right when things need to be happening. So that's just a few comments. And Unravel helps you see what's going on. That's observability, base of the pyramid, observability. You can't manage it if you can't see it. And then Unravel adds management tools to this stuff so that you can get in there with all these different technologies and get your configurations right, get everything set up so everything flows. And then at the top of the pyramid is recommendations, and that's where AI helps us. Other companies use AI differently, to help with their solutions. But with us, AI is helping suggest solutions and even fix things before anyone knows they're broken. That's the most fun thing, is the stuff, in a good world, we never get any credit for it because no one ever knows there was a problem because we fixed it.
That's right.
People
that's a good. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought this up here, because that is the future, right? And I see tremendous potential for AI and machine learning, depending on how you set them up, of course, to monitor what's happening and to notice patterns and notice what is normal, what is different from normal. Maybe take a look at that. This is one of the things where ML and AI are so much more powerful than a human being can be, but we still need the humans to kind of absorb the totality of these things and make decisions about which direction to go, because gut instinct is still very, very powerful, because our brains have AI and ML basically just spinning all the time in the background. That's why you wake up with an idea. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
And
almost didn't make the post that time. The commercials kick in. They'll turn down. The reason you don't hear the commercials is they turn down the board for obvious reasons. But that was a great opening segment, guys. Thank you so much. So Floyd, I'll come back to you to begin this segment, and then Sheila bring you in a few minutes in. But that sounded great. I like that we tackled a lot of these issues and observability. I'm fascinated by that. And that's a whole space that's been really developing quickly. I mean, what was it? Who did Cisco buy? App Dynamics, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. For how many billion? It was like
the market. That's the easiest way to get rich in Silicon Valley is figure out something Cisco needs and develop it so they'll buy your company.
Yeah, exactly. No, I know. All right. So good. So coming back, let's see. Like I said, I'll throw it over to Floyd first, and maybe we can go. Well, observability is a great thread to examine, right? Because from the data ops perspective, that's what you want to know: is who's worked on this data, what changes were made to it, who's using it, where's it going, what's its intent, all that kind of stuff. And man, I have a lot of respect for the people who do those jobs, man, because that's just serious stuff, man. You got to really know your. All right, we lost Chris's video for a second, but I think he's still around. Chris, are you still there?
Yeah,
there he is.
I'm just going to step away for 1 second. I'll be right back.
Yeah, come back. All right, so we're back at 28. Yeah, Sheel, I can't wait to talk about Ascend some more too. We had Sean on a couple shows, I think year before last, maybe. That's a fascinating concept. Dynamically generated data pipelines, right? Using declarative software.
Declarative software, exactly. It's just a total inversion of the way of thinking about it, but
Yeah.
not that different than I'm sure Sean mentioned, but the traction with Kubernetes and the excitement around that. And so,
Mm-hmm.
declarative isn't feeling so foreign to people anymore as other parts of the stack, front end and React, Kubernetes for infrastructure, or even CloudFormation for infrastructure, whichever tool you might be using,
Mm-hmm.
just has brought this concept to be familiar to people, and
Yeah.
people have started to embrace it for its benefits. Yeah.
It's crazy. I mean, I would love to get a real long, deep dive on how the Kubernetes engine runs, because you talk to people who really know it. They're like, oh, well, we're not entirely sure.
Right. This is something Sean and I myself will talk about quite a bit within Ascend of just, as you move to these declarative systems, you need a very specific control plane, a very domain specific control plane in order to understand what's happening where. It needs to
Right.
know how to translate things. And so exactly to your point of what is the Kubernetes control node really doing and all of that, it's so domain specific, it's so terse in there that that sounds totally accurate to me.
So I have a great imitation. One of my best friends, a guy, Nikolai Minchukov. Nikolai is from Russia. Nikolai, very smart guy. And he said to me one day out of the blue, he goes, the funny thing about the web is that nobody knows how it works. All we know is it works. So you're just like playing around with stuff. We're more discovering than inventing, if you get down to it, right? You connect all these machines and they're like watching how they talk to each other, like, wow. It just, and now with AI, of course, and declarative technology, et cetera, it's just like these things kind of run themselves. And you're like, holy crap, what is it doing in there? Well, that's why you need observability. Maybe I'll throw that out to Floyd to start off.
Cool.
But I'd love for you to explain a little bit about how you observe.
LS.org.
Right, here we go.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back here on DM Radio, talking all things data ops. Ops, of course, stands for operations. Marketing ops, you hear about marketing ops these days. A lot of jobs in marketing ops, folks. I got to tell you, there's a lot of different technologies to understand, to weave together, to automate your marketing. That's the kind of stuff that we do. And it's a never-ending story. There will never not be jobs in that space, I can promise you. But let's get back to our guest, Floyd Smith from Unravel Data. I've been tracking these guys for a few years. In fact, very, very cool technology around observability, application performance management. You hear all the time, oh, our system is running slowly. If you're on a call center or something, well, why? Why is the system running slowly? Usually there's some sort of performance issue. And I can tell you from way back in the day, I had a guy on the show like 12 or 13 years ago. Never forget this guy, Zohar Gilad. He was the founder of Precise that wound up getting acquired by Idera. And it's basically performance management. It's trying to understand what the application is doing. And you get in there, and this is again 12, 13 years ago, but things haven't changed that much, except with AI, which Floyd kind of referenced. But what you look at are histograms. You look at histograms of CPU usage going up and down like this, storage going up and down like this, network behavior, et cetera. But you have to know how to stitch all that together. Like, well, why is this happening? This node went down. Why did that node go down? Why did this happen? These are difficult things to understand. And especially when you get to the scale of some of the solutions we're talking about today, companies like Apple, Cox Communications, Telco for decades has been knee deep in massive amounts of machine data, just absolute staggering amounts of machine data. So you're trolling log files, you're like pulling in whatever you can to understand what the heck is going on. And that's something that Unravel Data focuses on doing. So I think it's a nice parallel to data ops in general, Floyd, because you want to know what are people doing with this data. So tell us a bit about Unravel and how you achieve observability into these very complex systems.
Yes. So there's an old saying that which gets measured gets done, and you can't measure things that you can't see. We recently hosted an industry conference, and Chris was kind enough to speak at it at a founders panel. and we tackled, it was called DataOps Unleashed. So we're taking the power that's gathering behind this term of DataOps and unleashing it in a bunch of different topics. And we had a talk just about observability. Apache Airflow is a framework for pipeline work. I think Sheel will be extremely familiar with it, being in that area himself and his company. And so they talked about the importance of observability and how that applies to Airflow. What Unravel does is we have engineers take a lot of time for each of the major platforms we support, seeing where their observability points are, and we actually will add sensors to a system to increase the observability of that system. And then that then gives, both through exposing the information in its fairly raw form, that lets ops people do their work across a variety of platforms at once. They don't have to learn the ins and outs of how to gain observability for each technology. We've done that for them. We give them the data to act on. And then we also feed that data into our machine learning model and our AI intelligence built into the tool. And so that information then becomes the grist for that mill to turn out answers, and even in some cases solve problems, either solve problems for you or recommend a solution for you, and you just click and it happens. That's where we partner with the humans. So observability, again, is the base of the pyramid. We add to the observability of systems, and we organize the observability of systems that have decent observability built into them already. Right? And we make it uniform. You know, like the Mac did not make computers simpler. It made them easier to use. So we don't make the stack simpler, which is a very worthy goal, and I applaud everyone who's trying to do that as well. We ourselves do not make the stack itself simpler. We're actually in one more thing that you put, you know, into your toolkit. But what we do is we make everything within the system much easier to deal with. It's that Macintosh interface, which became the Windows interface, right? Difference being that when you get a Mac, it does what it does. With AI, the thing itself can actually improve. So that's a nice plus that we can offer in our system, is that capability to grow. But it's all based on observability. You have to see it before you can do anything about it.
Yeah, right. And you're bringing up a really good point here about the complexity of these systems and how they interrelate. I mean, anyone who's done troubleshooting, whether it's on code or on an air conditioner or on their automobile or whatever, if you look in the auto space now, a lot of that stuff, you have sensors that you can use to just tap into the engine, and you plug it in various places and it gives you all kind of information about what's going on. But you have to have some way to, as you suggest, to organize and then analyze that information. And I mean, the complexity of some of these environments is just beyond human comprehension if you really get down to brass tacks. So you have to get, as you suggest, sensors into it, and they show you, oh, well, when this fails, that often fails. Maybe there's a connection. Let's investigate that. And that's kind of what you're doing at scale. Is that about right, Floyd?
Yes, that's right. One of our customers that's been very successful, including with our software, but they've done a lot of things right for several years now. They've actually doubled in value twice in the last 4 years. And they were a big company before. Wow. They're now about a $250 billion company, really major. And nobody knows about it. It's kind of a secret business success story. So they're using our software. Their pipelines, a single pipeline will have dozens of components in it. It can, and every one of them is contributing value, but any one of them can break. And then you have to figure out where that happened. So that's where the observability helps you fix what's broken. Three things. Observability helps you fix what's broken. AI sometimes will fix it for you or recommend the solution before it breaks. But what does that enable? You know, why is this important? It's great to have fewer problems. It's great to have your ship be a little less leaky, right? But the thing is actually to get to Paris in less time than it used to take you. And what Adobe has done using a lot of tools is they have actually cleared the decks for themselves to be able to add in major new business functions. So they have an AI-powered marketing framework that they have introduced that's a whole new leg for their business that's doing really well. So that's helped that growth in the value of the company. So it's not just about fixing what you're already doing. It's actually about making what you're already doing easier so you can do more new cool stuff. And that's huge. Everyone listening out there, thinking about what doesn't work and the holes in the ship, yes, plug the holes, but also think about what you can do when that ship goes twice as fast. And so
Right.
that's what a company like Adobe is doing with great success.
That's very, very cool. It's a good segue to bring in our final guest, Sheel Choksi from Ascend. And I know Ascend, very, very cool technology. This company is really taking off. Dynamically generated data pipelines using declarative software. So declarative is where you say what you want the end state to be, and you let the system kind of sort it all out and build it for you, as opposed to the other form of programming, which is much more, I can't remember the name. I'm sure Sheel can use it for me. There's declarative and there's
imperative.
Imperative,
Yeah.
right. Where you tell it step by step what to do. Well, guess what? A lot of these machines can figure it out better than you can, at least if you have enough computational power to get that done. So tell us a bit about Ascend and what you folks are doing with data pipelines and how that plays into data ops.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key concept there is what you mentioned of declarative versus imperative. And for folks unfamiliar with those concepts, I'll give a very simple example of in a data pipeline world, what the difference might look like. So in something imperative like Apache Airflow, as Floyd was mentioning, you might say every day, go find all the files that I haven't processed yet from an S3 bucket, take those new files, transform them, okay, and then go load those files into my warehouse, let's say. The declarative paradigm of that exact same pipeline would just say, for all that is in this bucket, I want it in this warehouse. And the difference there is that the programmer is not saying the mechanical imperative instructions of what to accomplish. They're saying what the state of the world they want to be. Everything in the bucket should be in the warehouse. And then what Ascend does, or honestly just declarative systems do, is translate that into the imperative commands and figure out what needs to be done. And by separating those concerns, the declarative system has a lot more optimizations that it can run in order for how to do that transformation and how to make sure that it's up to speed. While at the same time, the developer is writing much less code and is moving a lot faster. What we see in Ascend data pipelines is we see 90 to 95% code reduction of boilerplate and mechanical operations, and developers building out pipelines 10 times faster. So that's the exciting part. Oh, yes, I got it.
Yeah, no. So this is interesting because tighter code is great. That's where you want to be. One of my beefs with code generation historically has been that it's not very tight. And granted, this is ancient history I'm going to throw at you, but it was probably 10 years ago that just for kicks, I loaded Microsoft Word and I typed hello world, and then I did save as HTML, and then I opened that document in a text editor, and it was like 5 pages of code, right? Which is like, okay, I don't need all that code. So explain how you're able to get to a place now where using this declarative technology, you can actually greatly minimize the amount of code. And just for anyone who's out there, I think it's pretty easy to understand. The less code, the better to get done what you want to get done, because for troubleshooting, because of computational expense, et cetera, you always want as tight of code as you could possibly get. How did you get to that place where you can generate this stuff and have it tighter than a human could write?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I would maybe pivot from a little bit of code generation into something more like a query planner, like a database engine, where when you're writing SQL code, it's a very minified amount of code, but there's a huge amount of code under it in the database engine that determines how exactly to execute that query. And so maybe instead of thinking about it as minimizing code in general, it's minimizing your code and leaning on complexity and optimizations of someone else's code. And like the same story that we see in database query planning, the same story that we see in compilers, you're seeing in declarative systems as well, where it's like the amount that you can do in hand-rolled optimization is going to pale in comparison to systems whose specific purpose is to do this, right? Then that's where some of that phrase comes of, you're not going to beat the compiler anymore these days, right? Trust the compiler, let it compile your code, let it optimize for you, don't hand unroll your for loops, and that is what allows you to move faster at a higher level of abstraction, trusting these lower level of abstractions to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's something I've heard from several other real smart people in the industry that say it's the advances in the compilers that have enabled whole ways of innovation on the front lines of building systems and doing new and cool things. Can you kind of talk about that for a second? Like first of all, who builds the compilers? Where are they coming from? And why is it, do you think that they're getting so much better?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think who's building these, right, are teams that are essentially dedicated to this part of the problem space. So right away there, I think that dedication to not solving one specific use case, but the more general problem of the abstract is why we see such great advances, is because both the dedicated effort and being able to sometimes tackling the more generic and the harder problem can lead to a better solution than tackling one specific business use case. And so that's really what we're seeing. And, to take an example, even outside of compilers that maybe more folks will resonate with, we can also chat about things like declarative front ends. So as people are building single page apps and using tools like React to more dynamically render their UIs, things like in Kubernetes or CloudFormation to provision infrastructure, being able to declaratively say what you want, and then have these dedicated teams like AWS's CloudFormation team, like Google and Kubernetes, have these dedicated teams who are just solving the problem of how to translate specs into running infrastructure. That's what's going to keep that investment going.
That's so cool. I mean, and the other side of this equation too is that I think the cloud has played an enormous role in sort of de facto standardizing how we do things. And as I go back through the history of how we got here, I think about service orientation, right? And service oriented architecture from 20 odd years ago. And the idea was you wanted fine grained services and coarse grained services. Fine is very specific, coarse is a bit more bulky, more enriched, I suppose, is a way to look at it. But to me, a lot of the principles of service orientation just got baked into how we build cloud. And so now that's kind of the standard of how things are done. And I feel like the standards are changing again and moving in this declarative direction. Is that about right, Sheel?
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing. And one of the drivers as to why we think certain things are moving to declarative is as complexity increases, there's only so much that one person can work on. And these control planes give us a level of abstraction that can sit in the middle and translate declarative to imperative while decreasing complexity. So as we were talking about data ops and how businesses want to move faster with data, and a lot of what I consider as part of data ops is an inevitability because businesses are going to want more from their data, want more from their teams. Complexity is continuing to increase. More data sources, faster moving data sources, that's a given. Declarative systems can help wrangle both of those worlds.
That's very interesting. And this is kind of getting into some of the deeper topics. We'll have to bring you back for another show to kind of go into that. But I look at the layers of optimization that you can achieve now, and the fact that we have these environments sort of loosely coupled such that you can optimize this and optimize that, and then at runtime they all just come together. That's cool. It's like changing the wheel on the tire of the car that's moving is one cool way I've heard it described. But don't touch that dial, folks. You're listening to DM Radio.
Here's the announced an automotive. You're clear.
And look at that, an automotive commercial that came on right afterwards. So that's the Matrix. The Matrix is real.
And it's listening to us.
That's right, all the time. It's responding to us, right? Isn't that what's the one about?
Yeah.
Is it quantum where they talk about that? Like what is it? Where they're like, oh, every time you look at it, it changes or something. I'm like, what?
Oh, yeah. That's
what like
the butterfly effect, like chaos theory. Yeah.
Right? Like, all right, sounds cool, man. But what the hell does that mean? All right, good. So roundtable up next. Sheel, I'll throw it back to start with you and then bring Chris back in, and Floyd. Anything in particular you guys want to dive into? Maybe just kind of wrap it all together about how data ops is really optimizing the value of data by viewing it as more of a production line and getting that visibility into which data sets are being used where, how, why, so on and so forth.
And the agility part too, how to make your customers successful. I think that's the other part.
Oh, there you go. That's good.
Yeah, I think that would be maybe a cool topic since we've hopefully convinced folks of the advantages of data ops, and so maybe inspiring, how to get started, some change, things like that.
There you go. I can tell you that like a big part of my motivation for this show in general was thinking about the 12-year-old, a 13-year-old sitting in the back of their dad's car, listening to some crappy talk radio show that they don't want to be hearing, and just hearing some interesting little comment like, well, that's kind of interesting. What is that all about? And there you go. Like you're off on your personal journey of learning and figuring out what you want to do with your life. It was, what's his name? Graham Greene, The Power and the Glory. I'm a big, literary guy from way back when. And he in that book, He's actually talking about a dentist in Mexico, and some kid is in the office, a dentist's office, and sees like one of the molds that you make for teeth, and it just like is fascinated by it, picks it up, looks at it, like it just strikes a fancy, and then that was it. And for the rest of that person's life, they went down that path of going into the dental world and learning all about that stuff. And I think that's just fascinating that, you know, you'll hear something, and not everybody does, but at some point you're going to have your world shaped by a concept or an idea or a person or something, and then there you go, you're off to the races. So we're trying to inspire the next generation of data engineers.
Oh, that's great. And I think that's true, actually. You know, you'd be surprised how many people listen to podcasts.
Yeah. It's good stuff, man. Better than commercials.
Yeah.
Although commercials can be fun.
Hey,
Are we coming back at 8:48?
no, the comment about commercials.
Yeah. I love your new commercial, by the way. It's very zen for the Gab Radio Network.
Thank you.
It's silent.
He's WCGO in Chicago. Chi-town, baby. Go White Sox.
Oh,
I know.
Oh.
They're all Cubs fans. Everyone's Cubs fans, man. I know you guys won it. You got it recently. Hold on.
From blood drives to distributing food, from responding to emergencies and protecting the most vulnerable among us, our mission is making America's communities stronger.
We are one family, and therefore we care.
We are the American Legion, veterans strengthening America. To learn how you can help, visit legion.org.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all about data ops. We've got an all-star cast on the show today. We've been hearing from Christopher Bergh of DataKitchen, Floyd Smith of Unravel Data, and Sheel Choksi of Ascend. That's ascend.io, and I think it's datakitchen.io and Unravel Data. Is it .io as well? I can't remember. I'll have to look it up. But we have a great question from our virtual studio audience. And by the way, thanks, folks, for joining in. You as well can join the virtual studio audience. Just hop online to dmradio.biz, sign up for our e-newsletter. We promote all these shows so you can be backstage and see how the sausage is made, as they say. But it's a great question. I'll throw over to, I guess maybe I'll throw it to Chris first, because you started us off. One of the attendees is asking a general question. How do you engage management to data ops? As a developer, I understand the benefits, but it's a really hard sometimes to sell the concept to clients. How do you, what would you do to sell it to senior managers?
That's a great question. I was just talking to a very large bank who's having the same challenge, right? And I think one of the things, the end effect of doing data ops means that you can deliver more insight to your customer in whatever form, a chart or a graph or a data set. You can do that faster and make them happier. And then they can trust the data more. So your company is more likely to be data driven. And that's the end of the game with data and analytics anyway. How well are the people in your organization adopting data to make better decisions? And so the premise is, if you can do it faster and you can do it with less errors, you'll be better. And so I think by talking to your management about the challenges you have and data ops as a solution, you'll be successful.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you help companies solve some of these problems. I mean, that's in general, if folks, if you think about data as a product and you use the manufacturing analogy, you got lots of little pieces that have to come together, they get assembled and they get shipped out the door. We want to know where all those pieces came from. You want to know who's managing those pieces, who has changed those pieces, who the manufacturers are, et cetera. And that's kind of what data ops does, is it creates a marshaling area for the data that you're going to use for analysis. instead of the old days when you just kind of had different people pumping it in here and pumping it in there, and you didn't really know where it came from, or at least a lot of times you didn't, and that's a problem. So it's observability around the use of data, the provenance of data. It actually sparks another question from an attendee. I'll throw this one over to Floyd Smith. Governance is the other issue. If you have a good data ops program, thereby you are going to have some governance structure to know provenance of data, use of data, all that stuff. That's the governance side, right, Floyd? Oh, you're on mute. You got to mute yourself.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Well
Yeah.
spotted. Yes, I did a stint at HSBC Bank in Canary Wharf in London years ago, and they talked about governance all the time. And I was out of startups, so I had no idea what they were talking about. But eventually I came to understand that roles, responsibilities relating to data are absolutely crucial, and of the company as a whole. You know, you're the custodian in any organization. You're the custodian of all the data that you gather, and you have to take that very seriously. So yes, enforcing governance uniformly across multiple technologies involved in a data pipeline, for instance, like Sheel's company does data pipelines for a living. So that standardization, observability helps. If you can't see it, you know, you can't manage it, you can't regulate it. So governance is like internal regulation, guarantees that if data goes in over here, it can't be seen over there, like that example you mentioned earlier, Eric. So standardization, speed, reduction of complexity are all important elements in governance. And in order to do governance right, you have to do a lot of things right. So it's a great management challenge. It's not just a thing you bolt onto the side of your ship. It has to be built in from early on and constantly, continuously paid attention to.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The bolt-on doesn't work so well. Like if you got to think these things through. And here's the good news, folks, with the cloud becoming so powerful and so prominent and such a powerful force in business, most companies, traditional brick and mortar, are still on-prem. On-prem data centers are not going to go away anytime soon. It's going to be a very long tail to that stuff. But as you reinvent your business, as you redesign, think like Floyd was just suggesting here, and Chris has talked about it as well. This is your opportunity to re-architect a system that is cloud native. That's a term we hear a lot these days, that can leverage the power of the cloud. So don't be afraid to reinvent your processes and your businesses and your pipelines. And this is actually a great line to bring in Sheel Choksi. We had an attendee ask a question in our virtual backstage here, wanting to know data quality. Is that something that can use declarative technology as well? I'm quite sure the answer is yes. It's just a question of how you go about doing that and how you design your control plane, right, Sheel?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's sort of two variations of data quality that we can talk about here. First is your own business logic around the quality. So maybe validating that certain columns have the right values and making sure that your pipelines are healthy in that sense. And that tends to be more coupled to your business logic. And so when we talk about that in a declarative paradigm, you're still expressing your constructs of what you expect healthy data to look like. Then there's the more challenging part of data quality that gets overtaken by a control plane. And that's the lower level operations of, can you prove correctness that every single record was ingested? Can you prove that there weren't any files left in blob store that were missing? Part of some of the observability that Floyd's been mentioning, right? You need to know what's in the data set. Has every file been processed? All of that. And by offloading all of that kind of imperative work to a declarative system that has a control plane, the control plane is there to even guarantee a lot of that correctness and quality for you. So you're abstracted away from it. It's a given.
It's so interesting. And I think the key is to, maybe I'll bring Chris back in. The key, as always, is to understand, all right, what are we trying to get out of this? What's the function? What's the purpose? And start small and sort of incrementally build out. So with your customers, I guess that's an interesting question. Maybe we can even use this for the podcast bonus segment. What are the pain points? What happens to a company when they look down? We saw one, of course, at the top of the hour of a huge mistake. Hopefully you don't have to learn from getting burned that badly. But what are some just classic pain points that you've heard from customers where you're like, well, let me tell you about data ops, Chris?
Well, a couple. The number one is like, it just takes forever to get a new idea from a data scientist or a data engineer into the hands of your customer. And you've got to have a lot of meetings and a lot of documents. And that process of iterating, the agility to have ideas and put it in the hands of your customer, I think is really important. And that just shows up, I think, from my experience. I think you've got to be humble about, as a technical person, what you think your customer knows. And so a lot of times us nerds like to go off by ourselves and build things and not talk to anyone for months at a time. And while that's fun, the thing that you built and spent 3 months building may not actually work. And it may not be what your customer wants. So it's better to ship something early, ship it often, get it 70% right, and iterate and improve. And that agility just produces things that are better. And so it goes against perhaps our grain as developers. We've got to take a little bit more risk, but it ultimately builds a better product. And I think that shows up in a lot of ways. And that is that cycle time of innovation is hugely important to helping companies be successful and to see the follow-up questions that come in any data and analytics system. It's all about a river of questions and sort of being able to navigate that river as opposed to sort of building a house and walking away.
I love that. I love metaphors. I could do a whole show on metaphors just all day. Metaphor, metaphor, metaphor. That's a good one, though. You can never step in the same river twice, right? That's a classic philosophical comment. We got about a minute and a half left. I'll throw it over to Floyd for a quick comment here. Observability is key. You have to know what you're looking at. What are some of the quick recommendations you have for clients to get serious about this stuff?
Oh, yes. There's a whole deep river that is never the same twice to immerse yourself in here. But the key thing is to think about delivering value out of the AI and machine learning work and other programming work that is happening in your back rooms. There's some impressive stuff that can happen within the business, but you need to be at least equal with and hopefully ahead of your competitors in figuring out how to get value out to them. So always think about the customer first. I was talking about our customer Adobe, and we've we featured several others, when we had the conference with DataOps Unleashed. These things are a lot of fun, and they're wonderful to talk about among people who do them for a living like ourselves. But it's all about the difference it makes out there in the world. So just keep focusing on that. If you're an investor, you want to hear that from your companies. You want to hear them use these terms. You want to hear them on the cutting edge of technologies we're talking about, but always talk about the why. What are we trying to make happen in the world, in your world, in the customer's world with this. And I think we've kept some of that focus here today. And so just keep that up. Making discipline.
That's good. That's good stuff, folks. And yes, in fact, let's do the AI stuff of the podcast bonus segment. Great point ending here by Floyd Smith. AI needs data ops. We'll be right back here listening to DM Radio.
All right, E, clear. Good job.
Thank you, buddy. You're the best.
All right, see you later.
Talk to you Monday. All right, so we can start right at the top of the segment here. I'm glad you brought that up. This is a great podcast bonus. Maybe I'll throw it over to Sheel first, and then Chris, and then Floyd. And it's just 8 minutes, so it's going to fly by. But I'll just tease it up here, and then again, let's talk about why you want data ops before you unleash all this AI on your data. All right, so hold on. I'll start in just 10 seconds. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on DM Radio, talking all things data ops with the experts. We have Christopher Bergh of DataKitchen, Floyd Smith from Unravel Data, Sheel Choksi from Ascend. And Sheel, I'll throw this over to you first, because you know a lot about AI. Very, very powerful technology, but AI needs to be trained. Now, the algorithms are typically trained on data, large sets of data. You can train them on each other. That's an interesting thing that's happening out there. But usually you train them on data. And Floyd actually mentioned this earlier about data drift, that you have to be careful about what data you're feeding these things. And that's really true for people getting started. If you don't have data ops in place, you're probably going to unleash your AI algorithms on data that it should not be seeing. What do you think about that, Sheel?
Yeah, I'd say the maybe overly used phrase comes to mind of garbage in, garbage out. And so if you aren't really sure what you're training on in terms of the accuracy of the data, if it's the right data set, if it's a complete data set, if somebody hadn't pre-filtered it to maybe all the values that were negative values instead of positive values, for example, you will get a model. You will always get a model. But what is it going to do? How is it going to behave? Is it going to provide any value to the business? Questionable on all fronts. And so, as we talk about the benefits of data ops, a lot of it is moving faster with data. But the ability to move faster is because you have confidence in the data. You have some type of tests, you have maybe version control, CI/CD, all these practices that tie into really high quality trusted data sets. And when you adopt this data ops practice and you are going into training with that confidence, let's say, then you have great confidence in being able to do the models and being able to iterate on the models. Retraining a model becomes not as big of an exercise because you have the data sets ready, constantly being updated. Being able to get more models going, not a big problem because you can turn around data sets quickly with the right fidelity. And the velocity that you get on data ops also will carry over to the velocity that you get on ML, AI ops, that side of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great answer. And Christopher Bergh, I'll bring you back in. The other side of the equation here is with AI, increasingly, especially for healthcare, for pharmaceutical, for financial services, we have this whole concept of explainability. We've done whole shows on this idea, meaning you as the business owner or process owner need to be able to explain to an auditor or your investors or whomever how this thing came about with its answer. And I'm thinking that data ops really helps there because you can have metadata about the data sets. This data is consumer data taken from this source for that particular purpose. That's the kind of stuff that GDPR wants. They want to know, why are you using this data? What is the purpose of it? What's the provenance of the data? All that kind of fun stuff. If you have a data ops program, you've got that going on, right, Christopher?
Yeah, well, no model is an island. And so the result of doing all your work in AI is something called a model. And that doesn't exist in absence of anything else. It's fed and trained by data. It's delivered to some other system like an application or UI. And the journey that things take when that model is up and running from source to value, I think is something that needs to be governed and managed and counted and tracked and observed. And so, it's great that we do AI, but AI doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a whole system, and being able to monitor and track and govern that system is as important as the model itself.
Yeah, real quick, back to you, Chris, before Floyd gets a final comment here. The other thing that gets me so excited about this is that there's so much to learn from every single person in the company, the developers, the senior executives, the managers, the marketers, the salespeople. You can all learn by talking about the data and what it's used and where it came from, because context is like 98% of understanding. It seems to me 2 words can mean anything depending upon the context. And so context is what data ops gives you. It gives you the ability to manage context and understand it and share it. Is that about right, Chris?
Yeah, and also how do you get everyone in your organization to interact with data? Because the context is everywhere, and it's not in one person's head, it's shared across the organization. And best-in-class organizations are turning everyone, not just the elite 1% of people who are the sort of data leaders. It's 10%, 20, 30, 50% of your company is dealing with data in some way and building these complicated data systems. So how do you, if no model's an island, well, there's a lot of people on that island who are working with data, and you want more because the context is everything.
That's funny. And Floyd Smith, last but not least, Unravel Data. I mean, you've talked about some of the cool places that you've worked, and in cool places, cool things happen because you have a good culture, but also because you have good processes in place to enable people to do cool things. So you're not stuck in the weeds. When we started talking with Christopher earlier about ending suffering, right? If you're behind the 8 ball all day long trying to hit data batch windows or trying to troubleshoot systems, man, it's just very demoralizing. But if you do have good sound processes, if you do have a good data ops, if you do have observability, guess what? Your people can do cool things and have fun, and that's good for morale, right, Floyd?
Yes, yes. And I think making cool things happen is my North Star. Ending suffering is a bigger problem than I've been convinced to take on yet.
That's funny.
I'll leave that one to other experts. And let me just finish by promoting the recent conference we had, Data Ops Unleashed. It's a place to discuss all of these things. So we've got tons of sessions on there, just like there's lots of great sessions here on DM Radio that you have recorded as a podcast. On DataOps specifically, we've got a lot of great recorded DataOps Unleashed sessions, including the sit down with Chris, but a lot of other people on different aspects of these issues. So you can start educating yourself. You mentioned putting DataOps in place before you unleash AI on your data. Startups are always about building the airplane as you're flying it. So you're probably unleashing AI on your data right now. So as you're doing that, build in some of these good practices that fall under these banners: DataOps, AIOps, MLOps. Work with people who are interested in the systems aspect of it, so that that can complement delivering the next great thing, so that the airplane stays in flight as you add power and passengers to it.
Yeah, that's good stuff. And we got about a minute left, so I'll give Sheel one last chance to comment on this. And just forward-looking stuff. I mean, I could tell you're a very positive outlook kind of guy, and you kind of see the big picture of where things are going. And to me, this declarative approach and really focusing on the ops, focusing on improving things, it's just such a wonderful journey to begin, because there are so many things that can be improved. They're just everywhere, right? Just because something's broken doesn't mean it can't be improved, right, Sheel?
Yeah, and that's the way that I would encourage people getting onto this journey. Is there's a lot of moving pieces that fit together to get into a true data ops culture. And to use again a little bit of a contrite example, your golden triangle, your people, your process, and your technology, and they'll all kind of have to move forward and improve. But that doesn't mean that these principles can't be immediately applied to day-to-day issues that have come up. Tomorrow, if one report looks wrong, maybe that's just a great place to insert one little test and start getting the benefits of some stability that way. And as the org continues to grow this way, sees the benefits of those small iterative improvements, being able to determine, coalesce into that data ops driven organization.
I love it, folks. We'll look all these companies up online. Again, Christopher Bergh from DataKitchen, Floyd Smith from Unravel Data, and Sheel Choksi from Ascend. We'll talk to you next time. We're booking the second half of the year right now, folks. So send me an email, info@dmradio.biz, if you want to be on the air. 22 markets and growing. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.
Thank you, Eric.